Dad, who are they?
Your father entered an agreement, baby doll. He lost.
Please don't do this, I beg you!
Okay, baby doll, then you'll pay for his life. Live with me for 365 days.
No, I can't do this.
But your father can. Sign it.
Dad, what are you doing? Please, no. Dad, please! Help me, Dad! I can't do this, Dante.
You don't have a choice. Come with me.
Please.
Get in the car.
She had come home late to save $30 on a cab. That was the only reason she was standing in her own living room at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. Still wearing her diner uniform, still smelling like burned coffee and table grease, watching two men in expensive suits stand against her walls like they belonged there. Her father was sitting on the couch. Ray Chen, the man who had taught her to ride a bike. The man who had cried at her high school graduation. The man she had been quietly holding together for the last 3 years, was sitting with his shoulders folded inward and his eyes fixed somewhere on the carpet between his feet. He wasn't looking at her. He hadn't looked at her since she walked through the door. The man in the armchair was different. He was sitting the way people sit when they own the room. One leg crossed over the other, both hands resting loose on the armrests. His expression carrying the particular kind of calm that doesn't come from peace. It comes from never having been told no. He looked to be in his early 30s. Dark eyes, a jaw that could have been carved. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Aria's monthly rent. And he was watching her the way you watch a door that's just been opened with mild passing interest. He did not introduce himself. He didn't need to. Aria already knew who Dante Voss was, the way most people in certain circles knew, not from meeting him, but from the careful way adults went quiet when his name came up in conversation. She looked at her father. Dad, her voice was flat. What did you do? Ray Chen pressed his lips together. He still wasn't looking at her. One of the suited men near the wall stepped forward, placed a single sheet of paper on the coffee table. It was a contract. Aria could see her own name printed in the middle of it from where she was standing. And something cold moved through her chest like a current. Dante Voss spoke for the first time. Your father entered a private arrangement 6 weeks ago, he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. The terms weren't met. This is the resolution. Aria picked up the paper. She read it once. Then she read it again because the first time her brain had refused to process it properly. 365 days. His estate. His terms. In exchange for her father's debt being cleared and her father's life being left undisturbed, she set the paper back down very carefully. Then she picked up the pen that had been placed beside it and threw it across the room. Absolutely not. Her voice came out louder than she expected. You don't get to sit in my house and put my name on a piece of paper like I'm something my father owns. I am not a thing. I am not a payment. And whatever he agreed to, he didn't have the right to agree to it. Dante Voss looked at her without blinking. He let her finish. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't look at his men. He simply waited until the air after her words settled, and then he said, You have 20 minutes to pack. That sentence hit the room like a door slamming shut. Aria turned to her father. She needed him to stand up. She needed him to say something, to push back, to be the parent for 10 consecutive seconds of his life. Ray Chen finally looked up at her, and what she saw in his face wasn't guilt. It was relief. The quiet, shameful relief of a man who had just handed his problem to someone else. That was the moment something inside Aria went very cold. She screamed. Not a performance, not a tantrum. The kind of scream that comes out of a person when the floor disappears beneath them and the falling is real. She told Dante Voss exactly what she thought of him using words she hadn't said out loud since college. She told her father what she thought of him too. She knocked a stack of mail off the counter and didn't care that it scattered. One of the suited men near the wall actually took a small step backward. Dante Voss did not move. He checked his watch. 18 minutes, he said. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city. Aria sat in the back of a black car with a bag she had packed in 17 minutes and a chest full of something she couldn't name yet. It was somewhere between grief and rage and the particular shame of having no good options. The two suited men were in the front. Dante Voss was in a separate car ahead of them. She hadn't spoken since the living room. The iron gates opened without a sound when they arrived. The driveway was long and tree-lined, and the house at the end of it was enormous in the way that felt less like wealth and more like a statement. Every light on the ground floor was on. The staff standing near the entrance didn't look surprised to see her. They looked like they had been told exactly what to expect. A woman named Mrs. Holt, mid-50s. Gray hair pulled back, the expression of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it handed. Aria, a folded piece of paper before she had even fully stepped through the door. It was a printed schedule. Aria unfolded it slowly. Breakfast service began at 7. Household duties were outlined by wing. There was a column for restrictions, areas of the estate she was not permitted to enter without being accompanied. At the bottom of the page, her room number was printed. In small, clean font, she looked up at Mrs. Holt. "This is a staff schedule." Looked back at her with an expression that said nothing and confirmed everything. Aria's room was near the kitchen. It was small and clean and functional, with a single window that faced the side garden and a bed with white linen that smelled like it had been freshly laundered for someone who was expected and not particularly welcomed. She sat on the edge of it and held her bag in her lap for a long moment. Then she reached inside and pulled out the one thing she had grabbed in those 17 minutes that had nothing to do with survival. A small sketchbook, soft cover, half filled with drawings she had been making since she was 16. She set it on the nightstand. She kept her hand on it for a moment longer than necessary. It was the only thing in this room that was hers. The first dinner was the kind of thing Aria would spend a long time trying to forget. Dante had associates at the estate that evening, for men, well-dressed, speaking in low voices around a table set with candles and good china. Aria was given a white shirt to change into and told by Mrs. Holt, without any particular emotion, that she would be serving this evening. She stood in the doorway of the dining room holding a water pitcher and understood with complete clarity what was happening. These men didn't know her name. They didn't look at her face. She moved around the table, refilling glasses, and they kept talking, kept laughing at something one of them said, and she was as invisible to them as furniture. Dante Voss was at the head of the table at one point, and only once he looked up at her. His gaze moved across her face the way you glance at a clock, taking in the information and moving on. Then he turned back to the man speaking beside him and did not look at her again. Aria walked back into the kitchen. She set the pitcher down on the counter. She stood very still and breathed through her nose, and told herself she was not going to cry in someone else's kitchen at 11 o'clock at night. She didn't cry, but it was close. The next morning was different only because of Leo. Aria had been awake since 6. She had followed the schedule because she had no better plan, yet and because the alternative, refusing and finding out what that meant in a house like this, felt worse. She was standing at the kitchen counter at 7:15 when she heard footsteps coming down the back hallway, small and quick and completely unconcerned with being quiet. The boy who appeared in the kitchen doorway was 8 years old, dark-haired, wearing pajama pants with cartoon rockets on them and an expression of open evaluation that only very young children and very old people still wear without embarrassment. He looked at Aria for a long moment. "Are you the new cook?" he said. The last one cried a lot too. Aria blinked. "I'm not crying." Leo tilted his head to one side. "Your face is doing the thing," he said, in the tone of someone delivering a perfectly reasonable observation. Aria stared at him. Then, despite every reasonable effort not to, she felt something in her chest loosen by exactly 1 degree. "What thing?" she said. Leo pulled himself up onto one of the kitchen stools and reached across the counter for an apple from the fruit bowl. "Completely at home. The try not to cry thing," he said. "My teacher does it too. Right before she sends someone to the principal." Aria looked at this child. This completely unfiltered, utterly unbothered child who had walked into her worst week and was currently eating an apple and studying her like she was an interesting problem to solve. "What's your name?" she said. "Leo," he said, mouth half full. "My uncle owns this house. He's kind of a lot." Aria turned back to the counter before Leo could see whatever her face was doing. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I noticed." She had been at the estate for 9 days when Dante walked into her room without knocking. It was early evening. The light through her small window was going amber, and Aria was sitting cross-legged on her bed with her sketchbook open. Drawing the garden she could see from the glass, the stone bench, the overgrown rose arch. The particular way the shadows fell between the hedges in the hour before dark, she had her knees pulled up and her shoulder hunched inward. She was so focused that she didn't hear the door. She heard the footstep. She startled badly, the kind of full-body flinch that sends everything flying. And the sketchbook left her hands and hit the floor. Pages fanned open and several loose sheets scattered across the carpet drawings, some finished, some half-formed. All of them private in the way that creative work is always private. Dante Voss stood just inside the doorway. He was holding the printed schedule. Apparently, there was a discrepancy in her afternoon hours that he had come to address. He looked down at the scattered pages on the floor. He crouched and picked one up. It was a drawing of the kitchen window, detailed and quiet, the morning light coming through in careful cross-hatched lines. Aria was off the bed in 2 steps. "Those are mine." She took the page from his hand with more force than was probably wise. He let her take it. He stood up slowly, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He looked at her. Not the glancing at-a-clock look she had catalogued from the dinner table. He looked at her the way you look at something when you're trying to understand it. Held for 3 full seconds, and then he set the schedule down on the corner of her dresser and walked out. No apology. No explanation. The door clicked shut behind him. Aria stood in the middle of her room with the page, pressed against her chest and her heart beating too fast. She told herself it was anger. It was probably anger. She gathered the rest of her pages off the floor and tucked them carefully back into the sketchbook. She kept it in her lap for the rest of the evening. 2 weeks in, the night he crossed a line, was also the night she stopped him with 7 words. There had been a late meeting at the estate. Men coming and going from the study, voices low. The particular tension that gathered in the house whenever Dante was conducting what Mrs. Holt referred to, with great neutrality, as business. Aria had kept to her wing. She had learned that was the safest thing. One of the associates, older, heavyset, the kind of man who had been powerful long enough to stop being careful, had passed her in the hallway before the meeting ended. He had said something. It was brief and dismissive and entirely about the way she looked. And Dante had been 2 steps behind him when it happened. Dante said nothing. Aria had kept walking. She had gone to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and felt the particular exhaustion of being in a place where your discomfort was other people's indifference. She heard the knock. Not the non-knock from 9 days ago, an actual knock. 2 short raps, and then the door opened before she answered it. Dante stood in the doorway. The meeting had clearly ended. He was still in his suit jacket, collar loosened by 1 button. The intention behind him standing in her doorway at this hour was not ambiguous. Aria didn't scream. She was done screaming. She had screamed in her living room 2 weeks ago, and it had changed nothing. She was sitting on the bed with her sketchbook closed on her lap, and she looked at him with eyes that were just tired. Deeply, completely tired in the way that goes past anger and arrives somewhere quieter, she said, "If you do this, you're no different from my father." 7 words. Spoken without heat, Dante Voss stood in that doorway for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. It wasn't guilt exactly, and it wasn't shame exactly, but it was something in that neighborhood. Something that sat in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back. He pulled the door closed. His footsteps moved away down the hallway and didn't come back. Aria sat in the dark with her sketchbook and listened to the estate go quiet around her. She didn't feel victorious. She felt hollowed out in the specific way of a person who has survived something they shouldn't have had to survive at all. She opened her sketchbook to a blank page. She didn't draw anything. She just kept her hand flat against the clean white paper until her breathing slowed. After that night, Aria stopped fighting, not because she had given up, and not because she had forgiven anything. She stopped because she had looked at the shape of the next 347 days and understood that spending all of them at war was going to break her before the contract ever ended. So she recalibrated. She did what was required of her: the schedule, the duties, the meals, the household tasks, and she did them quietly and efficiently and without argument. The screaming stopped. The resistance stopped. The mornings where she had stood in the kitchen doorway, deciding whether today was the day she refused, those stopped too. The estate filled with a different kind of tension. Dante Voss was a man who had been prepared for many things. He had learned to navigate hostility and fear and negotiation and silence of the strategic kind. What he had not been prepared for was the particular quality of Aria's new silence, which was not strategic at all. It was just a young woman moving through his house like someone who had accepted a hard thing and was now simply living inside it. He noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping that you hadn't realized you'd been hearing. He walked past the garden on a Thursday morning, and she was sitting on the stone bench with her knees pulled up and her sketchbook open across her thighs, drawing something in the careful, deliberate way she had, her whole body angled toward the page. She didn't see him. The morning light was coming through the rose, arch and catching the side of her face, and she looked so entirely absorbed in what she was doing that she seemed to be somewhere else completely. Dante stood at the garden's edge and watched her for 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. He told himself it meant nothing. He was a man who had built his entire life on the discipline of meaning nothing by accident. But he had stood there for 4 seconds. And Dante Voss was not by nature a man who stood still. She had stopped fighting for a reason she couldn't explain yet. And he had started watching for a reason he refused to name. The woman arrived on a Friday afternoon in a car that cost more than most people's houses. Aria was in the side garden when the gates opened. She wasn't paying attention to the driveway. She was sitting on her stone bench with her sketchbook, working on a drawing of the rose arch that she had been returning to all week, adding detail in small, careful increments the way she did when something felt worth getting right. She heard the car. She heard the doors. She heard the particular shift in the estate's atmosphere that happened whenever someone important arrived, the staff straightening, the pace of footsteps changing, the house pulling itself together like a person, adjusting their posture. She looked up. The woman walking toward the front entrance was the kind of composed that doesn't happen naturally. It was practiced, built over years of being watched and knowing it. She was around 29, dressed in a pale coat, dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless and wasn't. She moved through the estate's front courtyard without hesitation, without looking around to take in the space, the way you move through a place you've already decided is yours. Aria watched her disappear through the front door. She looked back down at her sketchbook. She told herself it was none of her business. She drew 3 more lines on the rose arch and couldn't remember making any of them. She found out the woman's name that evening through the particular information network of a large household, which is to say, through Mrs. Holt saying at once, quietly, to another staff member in the kitchen hallway, not realizing Aria was 2 feet away on the other side of the open pantry door, Serena Alcott. Aria didn't know that name. But the way Mrs. Holt said it carefully, with the specific neutrality of someone choosing not to editorialize, told her enough. She carried that name upstairs with her that night and said it, down next to everything else she was already carrying. The conversation happened the following morning. Aria was coming down the back staircase when she heard Dante's voice from the study, low and unhurried, the way he always spoke, but with a particular flatness that meant he was not in the mood to be argued with. She couldn't hear the other voice clearly. She caught fragments. Something about families. Something about timing. Something about arrangements that had been in discussion for several months and needed to move forward before the end of the quarter. She kept walking down the stairs. She kept her hand on the banister and her eyes forward and her pace steady. She went to the kitchen. She made herself a cup of tea she didn't want. She stood at the counter and held the warm mug in both hands and looked out the kitchen window at the garden where her stone bench sat, empty in the morning light. A political marriage. That was what she had pieced together from the fragments, an arrangement between Dante Voss and Serena Alcott's family. Two networks of power consolidating into one. It had apparently been in motion for months. Dante hadn't agreed yet, but he hadn't refused either. And in the language of men like Dante Voss, not refusing was very close to agreeing. Aria set her mug down. She went upstairs to her room. She sat on her bed and opened her sketchbook to a page near the middle. One she had visited twice already, without fully understanding why. It was a drawing of hands. Large. Still hands resting loose on an armchair, the particular way Dante had been sitting the first night she ever saw him. Unbothered and certain and completely in possession of the room around him, she had drawn them from memory without meaning to. The first time on a restless night 3 weeks ago, and the second time a week after that. She stared at the drawing for a long moment. Then she closed the book and pressed her palm flat against the cover and sat very still. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was staff. She told herself she had 314 days left, and then she was going home to whatever was left of her life. And none of this. Not this estate, not this contract. Not the particular stillness of a man who had watched. Her in a garden for 4 seconds on a Thursday morning, none of it was. Going to follow her out those iron gates? She believed. About half of that, Serena Alcott was at the estate for 3 days. During those 3 days, Aria learned something about her that made her considerably harder to dislike, which was deeply inconvenient. Serena was not cruel. She wasn't cold either, not exactly. She was simply operating on a frequency that didn't include Aria. She looked through her the way you look through a window. Not hostile, just focused on what was on the other side. On the second day, there was a small gathering in the sitting room. Dante, Serena, 2 men Aria didn't know, and the kind of low conversation that sounded like pleasantries and wasn't. Aria had been asked to bring coffee. She came in with the tray, set it on the side table, and began moving around the room with the quiet efficiency she had built into herself over the past several weeks. Serena watched her for a moment. Just a moment. Then she turned back toward Dante and said something in a voice that was quiet, but not quiet enough. You should be more careful about what you keep in your house. The room didn't change. The conversation kept moving. Dante said nothing. Aria kept walking. She moved back toward the side table and straightened the coffee tray that didn't need straightening and kept. Her face arranged into absolute neutrality. Her hand around the tray's edge was white-knuckled, and she was aware of it and couldn't fully relax. It from the corner chair where he had been sitting with a juice box and the unconcerned expression of someone who had not yet learned to pretend. Leo looked up. He looked at Serena. He looked at Aria's hand on the tray. He looked back at Serena. I don't like her, he announced. In the clear, carrying voice of a child who has made a considered judgment, the room went still. Serena turned to look at him with an expression of mild, polished surprise. The 2 men Aria didn't know found something interesting to study on the far wall. Aria kept her eyes down. Dante looked at his nephew for a long moment. Something passed through his expression, brief and controlled, there and then gone, and he said evenly, Leo, just the name. Nothing else. Leo shrugged and went back to his juice box, apparently satisfied that he had contributed meaningfully to the conversation. Aria carried the tray out of the room. In the kitchen hallway, alone, she let out a breath she had been holding for 4 solid minutes. And then, quietly, in the privacy of a house where no one was watching, she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and felt something that was dangerously close to a laugh. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything shifted. Aria hadn't planned it. She wasn't performing anything. She had come downstairs after finishing the East Wing schedule and walked into the kitchen to find it empty, which was unusual for that hour, and she had stood at the counter and simply stopped. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was standing at the counter with her hands loose at her sides, looking out the kitchen window at the garden, and she was thinking about her apartment. the one she shared with a roommate in the city, small, cluttered, with a radiator that made noise all winter and a fire escape she used to sit on to draw when the light was right in the late afternoon. She was thinking about whether her roommate had found someone to cover her half of the rent. She was thinking about the graphic design internship she had deferred, whether they had filled her spot, and whether deferring it again would even be an option. She was thinking about what she was going to walk back into when 300 and some days from now those iron gates opened and she was on the other side of them. She was thinking about whether there would be anything left to walk back into at all. She didn't. Hear him come in. What are you thinking about?
Tae's voice came from
Behind her, not sharp, not demanding. Just a question spoken the way you speak when you actually want to know the answer. Aria turned around. He was standing near the kitchen doorway in a dark shirt. Jack had gone, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't the calculating look. It wasn't the indifferent look. It was something quieter than both of those, something that sat behind his eyes, was very carefully not showing itself fully. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying nothing. She had become good at saying nothing. Then she said, "I'm thinking about what I'm going to do when I go home. Whether there'll be anything left to go back to?" No demand. Just the plain truth of a 21-year-old woman standing in someone else's kitchen, grieving the life that had been redirected without her permission. Dante Voss stood very still. She watched something move through him, through his shoulders, through the set of his jaw, through his hands which had gone quiet at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward her or away from her. He just stood there in the kitchen doorway with the plain fact of what she had just said settling around him like weather. And for the first time in the weeks, she had been living inside his house. Aria had the distinct impression that Dante Voss did not know what to do with himself. He stayed in that doorway for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "The internship, what firm?" She blinked. "What?" "The graphic design internship." He said it simply, like the information wasn't surprising. "What firm was it?" Aria stared at him. "How do you know about that?" He didn't answer. He looked at her for another moment, and then he left the kitchen, and his footsteps moved away down the hall toward the study. And Aria stood at the counter with her, hands loose at her sides, and felt the particular disorientation of a conversation that had answered nothing and somehow changed everything. That evening he found her in the garden. The light was going. The stone bench was in shadow, and Aria was sitting with her knees pulled up and her sketchbook closed on her lap, not drawing. Just being outside because the inside of the estate had started to feel too small in the hours since the kitchen. She heard him coming, the particular weight of his footsteps on the garden path. And she didn't look up right away. He sat down on the far end of the bench, not close, but present. The bench was long enough that there was a full arm's length of space between them, and he sat with his elbows resting on his knees and his eyes on the garden in front of them. And for a while neither of them said anything. Aria kept her hands on her sketchbook. The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere past the hedge there was the sound of the estate sprinkler system starting up, low and steady and ordinary. "What did you study?" he said. "Still looking at the garden?" "Graphic design," she said. "Communication arts minor. Are you good?" She turned to look at him. He was still watching the garden. His profile was even and still and offered nothing. "Yes," she said, without flinching. He almost smiled. It was very small and very brief, and it moved through the corner of his mouth and was gone. Before she could be sure she had seen it, but she had seen it. She filed it away in the part of her mind that had been quietly cataloging things about him without her permission. She waited. Then she said, "Why did you take the bet?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "At the time it felt like the right kind of leverage," he said. "Leverage for what?" Another silence. Longer this time. The sprinklers kept their low, steady rhythm somewhere past the hedge. He didn't answer that. But he didn't stand up either. He stayed on the far end of the bench with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the garden and the space between. Them held something that neither of them had put a name to yet, and both of them were aware of. Aria looked back at the garden. She opened her sketchbook to a blank page and set it on her knee. She picked up her pencil. She didn't start drawing immediately. She just held it, and he stayed, and the light kept going. And the garden went from amber to gray. Around them, it was the first time she hadn't wanted him to leave. The storm came in late on a Wednesday night. Rolled in fast from the north, the kind of storm that announces itself with pressure changes and a particular quality of wind before the sky does anything visible. By 10 o'clock, the trees along the estate's driveway were moving hard, and by 11, the rain was serious. The main house handled it without trouble. The generators were good, and the structure was solid. But the power to Aria's wing flickered twice, and then gave out entirely just before midnight. Taking the lights and the bedside lamp and the small reading light above, her dresser all at once, she wasn't frightened of the dark. She found a candle in the bathroom cabinet and a matchbook beside it. Someone had stalked this eventuality, apparently, and she lit it and set it on the nightstand, and sat down on the floor with her back against the bed and her sketchbook in her lap. The candle put out a warm, unsteady light that made the room feel smaller and closer than it actually was. Outside the window, the rain was loud, and the wind was moving through the rose arch in long pulls. She had been drawing for about 20 minutes, when she heard the knock to short raps. Then the door opened. Dante stood in the doorway with a flashlight in one hand, the beam angled toward the floor. He had clearly been working late. The collar of his shirt was open by 2 buttons, and his sleeves were pushed up, and he had the particular, contained alertness of a man who stays awake long. After everyone else has gone to sleep, he looked at her on the floor. He looked at the candle. He looked at the sketchbook in her lap. "The generator for this wing failed," he said. "I noticed," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat down on the floor across from her, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He set the flashlight on the floor between them, beam still angled down, and the candle sat on the nightstand above them, throwing its warm and steady light across the space. It was a strange arrangement. The most powerful man Aria had ever been in a room with was sitting on her floor in a storm, with his sleeves rolled up. And neither of them was saying anything, and it felt less strange than it should have. She went back to drawing. He watched the middle distance. The rain moved against the window in long sheets, and the candle flame bent and recovered, and bent again. After a while, she turned the sketchbook around and held it toward him. It was the garden, the stone bench, the rose arch, the particular way the hedges threw their shadows in the late afternoon light. It was detailed and quiet, and it had been built up over weeks of returning to the same page and adding to it in small increments. He took it from her hands and held it in the candlelight. He looked at it for a long time. The way he looked at it was careful and unhurried. The way you look at something when you want to actually understand it, rather than simply register it. "You see things differently than other people," he said. He said it simply. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation. He was making for the first time about something he had been noticing for a while. Aria looked up at him. The candle was between them, and the room was warm and close. From the storm, and he was looking at the drawing, and she was looking at him, and they were closer than they had been since the night in the doorway. Different kind of close. The kind that arrives gradually rather than all at once and is harder to name when it does. He looked up from the sketchbook and found her already looking at him. Neither of them moved. The candle flame bent to one side and recovered. He handed the sketchbook back to her. He stood up slowly, picking up the flashlight. He said that the generator should be fixed by morning. He set it to the middle of the room, not quite to her. He walked to the door. He paused in the doorway with his hand on the frame, his back to her, and she had the very clear impression that he was deciding something. Then he kept walking, and the darkness of the hallway took him, and his footsteps moved away toward the main house. Aria sat on the floor with the sketchbook in her lap and the candle burning down on the nightstand. She listened to the rain. She looked at the empty doorway for a long time. She didn't draw anything else that night. 2 days later, the news moved through the estate the way all significant news moves through a house full of careful people in fragments. in the particular quality of a silence that arrives after something irreversible has been said. Aria was folding linen in the upstairs hallway when she heard two staff members in the stairwell below her. She wasn't trying to listen. She heard the word Alcott and went still. She heard called off. She heard this morning. She heard one of them say, the quiet disbelief of someone reporting something they themselves could not fully process. He told them directly. No intermediary. She set the linen down on the hallway table. She found Leo in the kitchen 40 minutes later, sitting on his usual stool with his usual apple, radiating the self-satisfied energy of someone who has recently received information and is waiting for the right moment to deploy it. My uncle canceled the lady's thing, Leo said, before Aria had fully cleared the kitchen doorway. Leo, the staff is talking about it, he said, gesturing broadly with his apple toward the rest of the estate. Everyone knows. Mrs. Holt made a face. Aria stood in the kitchen doorway. What kind of face? Leo considered. The kind she makes when something happens that she didn't see coming, but probably should have. Aria looked at this 8-year-old child, this completely unmanageable, entirely perceptive 8-year-old child. Finish your apple, she said. You should go talk to him, Leo said. Finish your apple. Leo took a large, unbothered bite and said nothing else, which was somehow more commentary than anything he could have added with words. She found Dante in his study. The door was open. Unusual. She had learned over the weeks because the study door being open meant he had left it that way deliberately. She stopped in the doorway. He was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at the driveway and the iron gates and the tree-lined approach to the estate's entrance. His hands were in his pockets. His shoulders were level and still. He didn't turn around. I know you're there, he said. Aria stepped inside. She stood a few feet from the door and looked at the back of him and tried to find the right sentence to begin with. And couldn't find any that felt honest enough. So she said the honest thing. Why did you do it? He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the driveway. Then he turned around. He looked at her across the study with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the controlled blankness, not the indifference, not the brief and quickly buried almost smile from the garden bench. This was something older than all of those. Something that had been sitting behind everything else and had finally run out of room. Because you were right, he said. About what you said that night. She knew exactly which night he meant. The doorway. The 7 words she had spoken without heat into the tired dark of her room. She had not expected those words to follow him. She had not expected them to do anything at all. The study was quiet around them. Somewhere in the main house, a clock was ticking, slow and even. Aria walked across the room and sat down in the chair across from his desk. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't pull her knees up or make herself small. She sat the way a person sits when they have decided to stay back straight, hands in her lap, eyes on him. He watched her cross the room. He watched her sit down. Something in the set of his jaw shifted by a small degree. He sat down across from her. They looked at each other across the desk. The late afternoon light was coming through the window behind him, and it made the room feel warmer than it usually did. Amber and clothes like the candlelight from the storm night, except steadier. So what happens now? She said. He held her gaze. That depends on what you want. She blinked. It was such a small sentence. Such a quiet, plain, entirely ordinary sentence. In 47 days of living inside his house, inside his contract, inside his rules and his schedule and his indifference, no one had asked her that. He had never asked her that. She looked at him for a long moment. I want the internship back, she said. Something in his expression moved. Done. I want a key to the East Garden gate. Done. I want Leo to stop telling me what to do. Dante looked at her steadily. That one, I can't help you with. Aria felt it before she could stop it, a real laugh, small and sudden. Rising through her chest and landing in the space between them before she had time to decide whether to let it out, she pressed her lips together. He was watching her with an expression that was very close to the almost smile from the garden bench. Except this time it stayed a half-second longer before he brought it back under control. The study was quiet. The clock ticked. The light through the window held its warmth. "I want to not be treated like staff," she said. Quiet, direct, without apology. He was still looking at her. "That's already done," he said. Equally quiet, equally direct. She held his eyes. He held hers. They sat on opposite sides of a desk in a study that smelled like paper and cedar in the rain that had dried on the windowsill 2 days ago. In the 314 days left on a contract that had stopped meaning what it was supposed to mean, sat somewhere. Between them, like a document neither of them needed anymore. The contract didn't end. The days kept moving the way days do, forward and then forward again, regardless of what the people inside them are ready for. But something had been rewritten. The following Friday morning, Aria was on her stone bench in the garden. The light was early and clean, and the rose arch was throwing its shadow across the path in the particular way. It only did before 9 o'clock. She had her sketchbook open. She was working on something new, not the garden this time. Something she had been thinking about for a while. The lines coming with more certainty than she usually felt at the start of a new page. She heard footsteps on the garden path. She didn't look up right away. She kept her pencil moving through the line she was in the middle of, because interrupting a good line was its own kind of loss. Then she felt the bench shift slightly beside her, not across from her. Beside. Dante sat down. Not at the far end beside her, the way you sit beside someone when you have stopped managing the distance between you. He didn't say anything. He wasn't looking at the garden. Aria kept drawing for another moment. Then she tilted the sketchbook toward him. It was his hands.